But I just refreshed it and now it's loading, so. It's a big sign. I'll double check on my phone for the audience.
We're live, so we don't want to get started.
Okay. All right, we're going to call the general fund budget section of the New Garden Township budget overview that we're working on. So if we could all please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, take it away, Chris.
All right, here we go. All right. Good evening, members of the board, staff, I guess the citizens who may be watching at home. Tonight is the budget workshop number 3, which for us has been in sequence. The state of the township update that was provided at the very end of August. We had the capital improvement plan to review the 5-year plan from FY25 through FY29 in September. And of course, this is the precursor for the overall line item budget workshops. First, we're going to be doing the general fund tonight, which includes elements of public safety. So we have members of Avondale Fire Company as well as Southern Chester County EMS in the audience to both address their own request as well as some justifications behind that and questions and answers. Unfortunately, due to a family commitment, Chief Greenwald's not able to be here from the Southern Chester County Regional Police Department, but he will be at the October 21st meeting for any follow-ups and discussions. We'll have another kind of supplemental, albeit somewhat shorter, summary budget review during that meeting as well. So we're at number 3 of 5 total workshops. After the one at the end of October, which is I think the 28th, which is a Monday night, will be to quickly review the enterprise funds, which will be for the airport as well as the open space fund, and a quick review on the sewer fund as well. And then open to any other discussions, and then just 2 workshops supplemental to that as required in November. I've just realized that we have one for November 4th, the night before the election day. And of course, this room will be cleared. So with permission to think about it, you don't have to determine it right now, to maybe move that workshop as required to a remote session. And then we could have the final one as required after that. But all this is to lead up to the November Board of Supervisors meeting, where we will be at that point with everything being fully discussed, do the motion to advertise the budget in order to be able to approve it in December. So we're still on track in terms of it. So just a quick update on kind of where we are in the process. But without further ado, we'll go into the general fund review tonight for the FY25 proposed budget. And it's easier to have a discussion of where you're at when you talk about where you've been. So I wanted to quickly summarize. I don't know why this is giving a reverb here. Turn it down a little bit. Is that better? For where we were, mostly dictated by the prior decade's worth of revenues and expenditures for the township. So this is something that's been pretty much parroted for every single budget discussion we've had in the last 18 months or so. So you shouldn't see anything unique or different here, which is why I'm throwing kind of the still summary slide on there. So this kind of just demonstrates where we went from our prior tax rate increase back in 2014, going from roughly a 0.75 to 1.62. And of course, in the immediate there, Southern Chester County Regional Police decision was conducted in the kind of mid-2010s to regionalize. And of course, that starts off kind of a sequence of events where we have all considered to be The increase in funding mostly from a police perspective and from a fire and staff perspective for the last decade. And then with that, with no subsequent property tax rate increases and kind of like I'll call it a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 nearly ratio of revenues to expenditures kind of growth, that built us into where we got last year when we started doing the budgeting process, where we recognized we had a $1.8 million structural deficit. So that's where we started this off in the last summer in terms of dialogue about where we were as a township. And of course, not being around for the budget planning cycle for FY23, that decision to structurally approve a budget that had such a significant deficit, we ended up spending a considerable amount of our general fund revenue fund balance over the course of a few years, ultimately dictated about $734,000 of cash as of the end of FY23. So we needed to close that gap as much as possible to be able to stop the bleeding from use of cash from our general fund position. And of course, that's where we did the compromise solution. We can talk about more in the next slide here, about having the kind of half rate recommended rate increase, as well as we used our interest income that we had been budgeting it for capital into the general fund to kind of close off that use of cash. So that's kind of a summary of, and I'll kind of go through all of these, of what I just talked about. And for the most part, you can kind of see that I'll call it smaller, stagnant growth in revenue over the course of the last decade. A significant part of the revenue drivers for that, it comes from our real estate tax and our Act 511 economic taxes, mostly in this case, earned income tax. And the net change of what the growth of that was versus the net change of what a growth of our primary expenditures were. This is, of course, pre-tax increase, kind of swung from a slight surplus into a massive deficit. And that's mostly because of the primary expenditure increases, which was for police, fire, and township personnel and staff. I want to also annotate that, when we made the decision to justify expending for personnel increases, specifically in this case, to establish a community development and life safety department, it was because we didn't have anybody here in the first place to do it. So we weren't executing really any of these required by law type items for a township. Specifically for us was that kind of land development, building and permitting function, as well as we implemented ordinances to have more robust inspection services on properties, commercial fire code, as well as rental inspections, which of course, in the kind of ecosystem here, improves your fire and safety services as well. So that was one of a missing, I'll call it non-compliance issue on our budget. And then with that, because now we have more individuals here to oversee that function, they're out there inspecting, you start finding more properties that hadn't done work with permits. So we're getting a lot of permit activity and permit increases because it's just kind of a compounding effect. So that was an investment into getting a net return. And of course, in our performance reports, you can see how that performance has been graded over the course of the last roughly about 12 months. And then of course, the remaining items was for not only adding public works staff, but increasing their rate. They were the lowest in Chester County. We made them kind of the middle of Chester County. As well as adding for parks and finance staff parks, because of course we have a massive park effort here as a township, and bolstering up our finance department personnel, specifically also to oversee our grants program, which is a key part of our capital strategy. So all of this together kind of compiled into where we were to where we are today. So quickly kind of go over some financial goals, and excuse me if you've heard all of these before too. So this was FY24 and kind of where we were looking at for the last year. I'll kind of just quickly roll through these, but the number one was just balance the budget, stop the bleeding. You remember that last slide? Just real quick, that happened. So we went from spending this much cash to the end of year FY24 spending no cash from our general fund position. So that worked. We ended up saving cash. That's good. We're not out of the hole yet, but that's one where that sizable amount of surplus, that interest income from the sewer fund helped kind of keep that from happening. But now it's moving into FY25, repatriating that use of interest income back into the capital fund, which gets you right into a hole immediately as you remove that from the general fund. But these were just the summary of items. I think everyone's been up to par and up to speed on these initiatives, so not much need to kind of go over them right now. We actually just talked about them during the State of the Township brief as well. And then just overall township goals, what we're trying to do to activate new growth, working with our regional public safety partners to be able to establish stronger wholesale relationships to help kind of stabilize some increases over time into the future. Just making sure that when we are reassessing our commitment to funding capital, it's capital for critical infrastructure projects and making sure that we're investing in the right areas to, number one, improve our road conditions in our township and make sure that we're being proactive in repairing certain infrastructure issues like, stormwater culverts and that nature, so we don't have, a massive issue down the road, let's say during a storm event or something, and, you get a culvert cleared out because it was overstressed and ultimately failed. Also, just kind of where we're at, we're working on economic development initiatives. The biggest one that we're working on right now is, of course, the zoning project. It's like the foundational element that any second-class township in Pennsylvania can do to kind of re-stimulate its approach to economic development. And then, of course, our master plans for understanding future capital liabilities. So we get a lot of questions about what's being done to improve transportation conditions over here or over here. Well, for the most part, that takes a significant amount of master planning and understanding what your ability to affect changes in those areas. And that comes through what we're doing right now, which is our Act 209 policy and implementation. Not only does it build that capital plan, but it also gives us the ability to impart impact fees, transportation impact fees to development for essentially having them provide revenue to the township based off an incurred cost of them creating more traffic within the township. So that's a good one. And then stormwater, the same as the kind of understanding our liabilities overall. So that would be your ability to kind of go out through the township and kind of understand and assess all of those weak points that we have in our infrastructure and understanding, kind of like you're replacing a road, it'd be like a culvert replacement plan, if you will. And that's one where it'll probably add up to a pretty big number. We'll have to look at that at a future date, but it's good to at least understand where your deficiencies are. So that kind of frames how we were thinking in 24, but moving forward into FY25, we finally got the ability to kind of understand the kind of coalescence of our comprehensive plan priorities. So pulling those initiatives forward from 2018 comp plan, and then also kind of bouncing those off those in-year priorities or those immediate priorities to kind of say that the things that we're working on today actually execute certain elements of our comprehensive plan. So that kind of prioritizes where you should be putting your funding moving forward. So that's something that we started talking about in terms of the board strategic priorities. This was back in, I think, March timeframe in April, based off of the comp plan priorities. So this is a 6-year-old document. It's publicly available. Anybody can go there anytime. These are kind of the areas as identified by the public that were ratified into that comprehensive plan. And that's one where comprehensive plan is only as good as you use it. So most times people get really, proud of the fact that they created a comprehensive plan, and then it kind of just immediately goes on the shelf, starts collecting dust, and you ignore it completely and just move on with what you were doing. So this is kind of blowing the dust off of that document and kind of folding it into our financial plan, just to make sure that what we're doing is as strategic use of money based off of taxpayer funding to get some of this stuff done to enhance our community. So there you go. And of course, it always means a reprioritization. So if something no longer makes sense, you also change the plan. If it's something that you might have been really successful at, like part of the comprehensive plan period was construct a new police facility. That was done like 10 years ago. In fact, they approved the comp plan and completed that project right at the same time frame. So it's no longer really a goal of the township to do that. So of course, this thing needs to be updated. So what we ended up doing was having the board kind of score your interim priorities, those kind of in the highest, I'll call them recognized issues that the township's facing. You kind of grade it out on an average score, and then we kind of put these into tiers as aligned with comp plan priorities. And so this means that, as it comes to funding, these are the things that we want to make sure that we're funding at the highest amount of rate based off of it's not only preconditioned public priorities, but it's also in the moment board and public priorities as well. So that leads to where we're going for in FY25, which strong financial management is kind of always sets the condition for anything you're doing as a township. The more financially viable and solvent you are, the better you are to be able to get things done. So part of that was also understanding when those future revenues were coming in and what you can do to plan for those revenue increases as they come in from new developments. It's been the sheer just ability to have that community development staff that's been able to kind of get some of these properties up off the ground and moving forward. So we actually have site preparation plans for 2 properties coming online for site development and preparation over this winter going into the spring, and then probably like a 2 to 4 year build out schedule for each property going into the future. And so that's new added tax base not rate, tax-based growth happening over the course of the next few years. So that's good. We want to stimulate those projects into motion here. And then, of course, we have the other ones on the cusp, as well as the ones that we don't even know about, but now have the ability to understand where we want that future growth, so we can start looking at what projects may be out there that we don't even have on the horizon or on the radar today, to continue that momentum to keep things going. Another one in terms of, we talked about economic development. It's not just necessarily creating the conditions, but it's also being very active on the ground and creating opportunities. So that's one where you don't just kind of sit back on your laurels and just expect economic development to happen. You have to be proactive about it. It's understanding your opportunities and growth areas and your assets, going out there, knowing who to talk to within certain industries to be able to get attention drawn to New Garden Township and a place to do business if that's what we're trying to do as a township. Of course, infrastructure investments, we're continuing that plan. So funding and keeping our capital plan intact is important, considering a significant part of our 5-year plan right now is about roads. I think it's almost over 80% is for roads and stormwater. I think I get about a call a week about Hillendale Road when it's going to get repaired. So until that's done, it's a mission in life to make sure that we're done with that road by the end of FY26. So keeping the capital plan moving forward, that will be complete by the end of FY26. That will no longer be an issue for the township, and that's a good spot to be in. Another one we're looking at just in terms of just continuing to get some facility improvements here at Town Hall, making sure that if we're ever going to see ourselves as a place, as a kind of a emergency response resource center, making sure that the lights can come back on in the event of a storm knocking the power out. That's a big part of it. And then just making sure we're completing our planning documents to be able to better understand how some of these items will yield future infrastructure investment requirements that we don't even really know about, right? And then, of course, always, like I said, we're working with our public safety partners to seek stronger, more sustainable relationships, adding in municipalities, kind of that wholesaling the cost, as well as making the operations, just that much stronger in of themselves. These are kind of the lower tier priorities, but still on the radar. It's kind of part of the overall model of the organization, being you want to make sure all those front end services are intact and strong, but you also need that kind of back end service to be strong as well, because a lot of the processing and computing to make that solvent is done by the back end office. So really, we're investing more into technology improvements, making us ability to use better intelligence, better data, better decision making, that kind of compounding effect when you just have the ability to process and synthesize information into stronger decision making reports. Enhancing community services. The one thing to do is enhancing community services through the advent of having a strong community outreach campaign. So the township hadn't done it in the past, but a lot of people do kind of like a paneling of the audience through a national community survey or some sort of community outreach and engagement function. Usually very early on in the fiscal year, you kind of capture those priorities, and then you fold it into your kind of preliminary financial planning, into your budget plan, and then you kind of do that feedback loop component of it after the fact. So you want to make sure that you're doing that. So that's part of our communications plan in the next year, as well as just making sure that we're just enhancing our own services. The biggest one that we saw as a weakness is our emergency management resiliency, to being able to kind of fold our township into a proactive response area in terms of liaisoning with the county. And then just, always making sure that, and we just had a very successful Community Day event. The guidance to the Parks and Recreation Board and the Parks team has always been leverage the current assets we have to scale strong community events, because that builds a better community just function in of itself. We're placemaking the township as a place that this is where you go, just have a great time, be with family, be outdoors, and enjoy some of the park spaces that we have. And that's going to continue to move forward. And then making sure that we still, as a value to the township, have a strong open space program, albeit in this case, what we're doing is we're not only making sure that we have open space capacity to seek future acquisitions to improve trails, but we're using our open space to also fund open space maintenance and services, as well as implement open space projects. So we're using it to its full capacity now, rather than just for straight up acquisitions and moving everything else over to the general fund, which actually ended up lowering the amount of cost for open space funded open space priorities out of the general fund. It's almost entirely now out of the open space fund. And we'll go over that in more detail at the October 28th meeting, but I can answer any questions about that tonight as well. it kind of sits as its own function, but still continue to invest in the growth of the airport. So part of that space up in the north side of the township being zoned for active commercial growth still has kind of an inherent relationship with the viability of the airport and using that as an asset to maybe attract and fold in maybe a future industry into that area up in the north side of the township. That's still part of it. And also understanding what that township-owned public land can activate something like that as well, because that's a big asset to have control of that property and kind of just melding the outcome of the airport with the outcome of the future commercial landscape in the township. And then, of course, one of the lower ones, but it's still out there. The township is currently a PA Silver status sustainable community. Our hope is to keep that moving forward, which keeps us viable for DCD grants, which is just a good thing to have in the first place. I believe we have to reassess that and trying to make sure that we're current. And then just looking at other facility improvements that we could to maybe have some EV charging stations done as just so we'll call them some light touch projects that we could do that really wouldn't come at a significant cost to the township. So without further ado, we can just go ahead and hop right into what this all means in terms of the financials, because I know we're all really looking forward to it. But overall, you know, this is kind of the second tab on the general fund proposed line item budget. And I like to provide this as a summary of what's happening for this year. So overall, from over the amended, we had both from FY24 performance, a net increase in revenues and a net increase in expenditures. The increased expenditures was because the significant part of it is for building inspection underwriters, which is our chartered, mandated, third-party commercial and residential building inspection service that we have to go by because it's part of our code. We can think about changing that if we ever wanted to, but that's one where all permit revenues for the township, they get a component of that one. It's about half of that. So if you get $500,000 in permit revenue, $250,000 of that goes as an expense to BIU as part of their service to the township. So the better you do, the higher that increased cost comes. So that's one where there was the in-year expenditure increase was the highest percentage portion of that for 24. And then in terms of primary revenue impacts for 25, the biggest one overall, right now you can see it, is the reduction of about $1 million in year-over-year change in interest, and that's because of twofold. One is we're taking that interest income from the sewer fund, the sewer investment fund, that $22 million principal balance that we have invested. We're taking the interest income from that, we're moving it back into capital to keep on track for our capital plan. And also, even of itself, if we were going to have it be year over year, we would already have a reduction in interest income anyway, because the rates already went down by almost over 100 basis points. So what you get out of $22 million last year is not the same you're going to get out of $22 million invested in 2025, which makes that a big reason of why that's a non-sustainable revenue. So at some point, that's going to be a depreciating asset that we can get value of. So it's generating one-time cash. It's always best to use that one-time cash generated towards capital items as one-time cost projects for the most part. And then, of course, when you fix it, then you worry about it 20 to 30 years down the road. So that's always going to be the recommended use of created cash rather than what we're talking about, which revenue, which is more for regenerative revenues coming from fees for service, from taxes, from anything that you can get revenues from for sustainable functions of the township over time. So that's kind of the big delta here. And then as well as just you have kind of the year-over-year planned increases as just the biggest one right now is for public safety for Avondale Fire and EMS, and they'll be talking about kind of what the justification is for that, primarily driven off of cost of personnel required in order to be able to man apparatus to keep our coverage, the response times the way that it is, and actually also to be able to improve it. And then we do have some decreases. So that was asked last year. It's like you're talking about all these increases, but what are you decreasing? So here you can see about roughly almost 200K of decreases coming out of the budget as well. And that's for just ways that we found cost efficiencies, the biggest one being engineering services. We moved a lot of those planned capital project engineering expenses as cash parts of that capital project item, and it just pulled all of that expenditure out of the general fund. So up until a few years ago, we were like 200K per year in engineering expenses, whereas next year we should be right over $100,000. So we lowered it by about 60-some-odd%. So that was kind of seen as a good thing. Because that's what we need in terms of just finding inherent efficiencies in our budget as well. So with that, all of this net combined, and this isn't the summary level line item detail, but these are kind of the big ticket movers. The biggest one being, of course, the reduction in the use of interest income gets us to about a 700K deficit from last year. Now, don't get me wrong, we were at 1.8 million last year. So we're doing well. We're on the kind of the right trajectory. And that was one where even last year, we talked about the full increase, and looking forward to where we are today, some things have changed a little bit. So we might not need that full increase as much anymore. Plus for FY24, because we're able to still be pretty efficient in some of our expenditures and have net improvements specific in this year. We had a higher, stronger EIT performance, as well as higher permit revenues. We created a surplus for in-use, almost over $700,000. We did a really good job as a township, really kind of sticking to the plan, and as well as kind of making sure that we didn't have a kind of a fallout for an unanticipated increase. And so the plan should be not to necessarily just roll that over in its entirety, do no increase in the next year, but to stretch that over the course of the next few years. And that's something that with that rollover surplus use kind of leaned out from FY25, 26, and 27, and we'll show what that looks like here. You also bridge the gap for having those new development revenues not continue to have to fill the hole that you're still in, but you lower the barrier to that FY27 planned increase that we need in order to keep the capital plan solvent, because you're still trying to be very proactive in making sure that we're improving roads and other capital liabilities in the township. And of course, that was one that was basically created based off of historical deferment. So continuing to defer capital is not a good strategy for this township because it's already been deferred pretty significantly. So what is included in this budget is full funding for fire and EMS based off of their justified requests, making sure that we're keeping up. Granted, there's been compression in the market overall for inflation, so we're looking at a nominal CPI type increase for personnel and staff. We want to make sure that we're still an organization where people feel like they're valued year over year, and you have a kind of a good kind of rollover plan in terms of just making sure that people are on kind of at least a cost for living type style increase over time. We want to make sure that we move that interest income back over to the capital fund. We're using rollover surplus that we're creating this year. We're moving more money from the general fund to the open space fund to fully leverage the open space EIT tax that we have for our open space fund. And then all of this comes at the behest of about a $500,000 increase, which is this 415K. So we're not out of the hole yet, but that was one where we were in a bigger hole last year. We filled it in with additional revenue. And so the next year, the hole is a lot smaller. So that means that we don't have to do that big increase. So we basically took a planned 1.13 increase and made it a planned 0.5. And so that saves a significant amount of potential tax revenue to our residents and businesses, which is also something we're trying to do. We're trying to be stewards to make sure that we're doing what we can, what we need to do, but also making sure that the affordability is still here for the township and our residents. And of course, these are the things that we still aren't really able to do with this one. So until we have that stormwater master plan, we're never really going to have a true up understanding of what our overall operating costs will be, mostly for capital. But even in the maintenance side of things, we don't really allocate a significant amount towards, I'll call them those like commodity type style replacements, maybe some quick fix items for culverts. This isn't planned for 27, but it's still out there, but it's not included for this year. It's very difficult to project what future EIT build-outs will be because we still have yet to see them develop a site. So once we get that site development and that build-out plan, we'll be able to model future EIT and the increase of the property tax base in terms of just assessable values of property, probably during the course of next year when these properties come online. And then, of course, the one thing that's still out there for the ballot referendum for the library tax, we won't know that until November 6th. But once that's done, that'll be voted by New Garden Township residents, and that'll be added into the budget. So this is a big worksheet showing kind of the categorical spend for all township departments as well as revenues. You can see what it means in order to have kind of a jump in that roughly $400,000 from the $500,000 increase and projecting that forward. And really what you're looking at, the fact that it kind of gets us to a 2-year stay of having a structurally balanced budget. Granted, in this case, it's through the use of that leaned out 3-year rollover FY24 surplus. So that's where you're seeing it broken down into kind of 3 buckets. And what this does is essentially gets us into FY27, where the only thing that you have in terms of really kind of that jump is what we need to do to fund future transfers to capital. And that's to keep us kind of in our solvent capital position. And as we said before, the biggest component of our capital fund is road improvements. So this is just a view of revenues overall. It's good that the percentage of sustainable revenues versus the percentage of non-sustainable revenues is going in the right direction. We want our general fund revenues to be 100% sustainable revenues. And that's one where last year that split was a lot worse in the wrong direction. And overall, these are just kind of where we get the primary sources of our revenues, mostly for this case, earned income taxes, our number one revenue source. And right behind that is property tax. And the one that actually increased this year was our permits, fees, and miscellaneous incomes, mostly from permit revenues. That's actually a growing piece of the pie, which is also what you want to do. We have a lot of commercial activity in this township. We have a lot of residential activity that was not being adequately documented and captured in terms of permit fee revenue that we have today historically. So that's good. So this is just a summary categorical level detail of all of our expenditures. And the big takeaway from this is just the fact that our general fund is skewed to kind of fund those key functions of local government, which for the most part is always going to be, if you have a police department, that's always going to be your number one expenditure. Same thing with fire, it's usually around number two. Public works and fire kind of equal each other, usually in terms of scale of funding, dependent upon the size of your township. And then of course your building and land development function because of the required amount of staff and personnel required to execute that. Everything else is about 13 different functional areas, and these are all compliance and driven for the most part. The only one that's really not is just how much you are transferring to your capital position. That can vary, and that's what we have here. But it's one where if you're talking about the general fund, you're talking about services, you're talking about core services, and then support for core services. And that's one where that sometimes gets lost because people will not necessarily understand what's the general fund funding for the most part. It's funding all of these areas, but your big ticket items are the ones that really you're funding, if you can think about it that way. So to continue to kind of beat the drum in terms of what's the biggest impact, and I think we probably all know it by now, if we are not going to do capital, expenditure growth over the next 4 years would be about 1.7. If we are going to do capital, expenditure growth is going to be driven by that capital increase for the most part, and you're going to have about a 5-year 10% increase because of that big jump in capital transfers. So that's one where if you're talking about capital, we're also talking about what that capital is, and for the most part, it's for roads. So really, if we're going to fund roads over the next few years, kind of an easy way to summarize it, we're going to need to increase expenditures. Now, how we fund that is going to be different. We're trying to fund that with future growth, not with tax rate increases, if that makes sense. So right now, that future growth is kind of right in that sweet spot. We have a planned capital increase in 27, and we might start seeing that economic revenue increase in 26. So the timing, in theory, works correctly. It's just to what degree. So this is going to be one where we have to continue to monitor those build-out schedules and understand when it's going to be coming into the township. Now, we hope people that paid a significant portion for some of the properties that we did have under land development application, like the Thompson property, that they're going to be motivated to build because they spent a lot of money purchasing that property for the development rights for it. So you think they wouldn't sit around idly by, but you never know. Same thing for the Bancroft Road. In fact, two of the reasons that our in-year revenue performance was higher was for transfer taxes because of the Bancroft property had to go from one development group it had to finally be purchased and transferred in its title between Modern Mushroom and the Bancroft Rouse Chandler Group. And then the Thompson property actually changed hands again. It was sitting around for about 5 years. They weren't doing anything. It changed hands again. So we actually got 2 transfer taxes from properties that already had approved land development applications, if you can think about that. So essentially, this kind of covers a lot of the understanding of what we've already talked about. So to keep a low rate, we're going to have to execute this plan pretty to a degree of specificity when it comes to making sure that all of these are always on the radar every single time we make a financial decision. We want to stay on path here. We want to make sure that we're executing our plan. Because if not, and some of this new development is unsuccessful, then we're going to have to make unpopular decisions. We're going to have to basically look at use of interest income. So therefore, your capital plan basically goes insolvent. So you say the biggest need is to make sure that we're not increasing taxes. So therefore, it comes out and it goes over here. And then we would have to obviously reduce it, which 80% of our planned expenditures directly support capital infrastructure projects. And then, of course, increase the rate or cut services. These are the things you don't want to get to at the very end here. So we're really going to have to focus on activating new development. And that's number one priority, as it was discussed. Well, actually, number two, strong financial management, but they go hand in hand. So we've said the capital fund a bunch of times. We already talked about it last month, but just to make sure everybody understands, this is the number that you're funding over the course of the next few years. And a lot of it is for roads. And these are some roads that have been long since deferred and they're in pretty bad shape. So that's one where we want to show that investment to our residents and businesses that this is a priority, but in order to have it be a priority and actually get executed, you have to fund it. And these are the only funding sources we have to get that done. And then last but not least, the backup to the capital plan, not backup to the backing of the capital plan is through a cash plan, because everything is about use of funds. We have a very intensive pay-go strategy, because one of the other things that was discussed was the not lack of will, but basically the preference to not issue debt in order to complete capital projects. And mostly that's the case when you're looking at maybe like facility improvements and other kind of matters where you're talking about kind of a leaned out expense. You can do some financing, but not necessarily having to issue debt to fund like a capital project, because for roads, that's kind of like a clunky proposition in the first case. But this is what we'll have to do in order to make sure that we have the net cash on hand and kind of a use of it year over year to give us a certain year-end, bottom-end balance, because you never know when you want to go below this number as a threshold, which for capital projects can happen pretty quickly if they kind of get out of hand, because as soon as you go below that number, it makes the beginning year available cash that much lower, which throws the plan kind of out of whack. So don't think of it like we're going to have a $500,000 balance sitting in the back of our cash reserve position, because that can change pretty quickly. So what does this tax rate impact mean? So overall, during the 24 budget planning cycle, originally, if you remember that, because it came out in that Chester County Press article, the 120% increase, we had a 2.18 mil structural deficit when you talk about property taxes. So the recommendation is if you want to basically stop spending your own cash, because you want to not deplete your fund balance reserve position, you had to go from 1.72 to 3.9. Of course, we even looked at the 3.9. Was that even out of scale for a justified millage rate for a township of our size? No, it really wasn't. But we also didn't want to just flood the impact of that in 1 year. So what did we do? We split the difference, essentially. We listened to our residents, and we did kind of like a meet you in the middle. We're going to do a half rate increase. We're going to reassess the situation next year, which we're in right now. And we're going to use interest income as an asset, because we did have rollover surplus from a prior year interest income from capital, because we deferred projects that were pertaining to our park projects. We deliberately did not do a continuation of the build out of the St. Anthony's New Garden Hills project. We stopped that and we held that balance in hand, and we moved it to FY24 this year. And we took that money and we paved Pemberton Road and replaced the roof, and we did some capital infrastructure projects. But now we're a year later, and even though some circumstances have changed, we're still in a hole. So right now, the goal is to continue to shift that funding back over to the capital fund, have that nominal tax rate increase, and be able to use rollover surplus from the general fund this time, not from the capital fund, from the general fund, for making sure that we have kind of like a balanced higher floor over the course of the next 3 years, while we're still waiting for those economic revenues to come in. So that's kind of what this balance plan really represents, instead of what we would have on hand if nothing improved for the better, of about a 1.13 millage rate gap. So this is kind of, we talk about our average assessment ranges. This is a kind of an easy summation to show how many, and while we're just talking about residential properties, this is for commercial properties as well. Everybody pays property tax, but it's easier to explain because our commercial valuations kind of are all over the map. But for the most part, we're talking about households in the township. For us, I think the average assessed value of a property in township is $186,000. And that's because you have like a kind of like a compression of households kind of within the 100 to 250K band that are impacted, or excuse me, knowing what impacts that band lets you know kind of what the overall tax rate will look like. So with that, for the most part, if this $500,000 increase goes through, you're talking about monthly increases between $3 to $11 increase. And that's would be for, like I said, for the most part, for people would be probably somewhere within that $7. So it's good to just understand what the number is. We also, just to kind of bring everybody up to date, because I hear constantly about how much is paid in property taxes, and they're right. There is a big significant portion of property taxes consumed from 3 different entities. But who is charging the most is also important to understand. It's just to make sure everyone understands, like, the significant portion of your property taxes goes towards schools. So when I hear about large property taxes paid by the average property owner, you know, the breakdown is one where it goes schools by a long margin, a wide margin, then county, and then still, even with an increase, we're still less than the Chester County millage rate too. So overall, we're kind of staying within our framework that we're using tax rate as a base, but we really want to key in on those other ratables that we have at our availability, which for the most part come from Act 511. So we really want to activate those earned income tax revenues by creating commercial viability for the township, for people coming in and working in the township, because we get 100% of that EIT. So that's one that we want to improve upon. So this was the summary chart. This is the kind of more detailed line item chart here. So this is one where you can kind of, it's like a matrix, just find where you are and move it all the way over to the right. And that's going to likely be what your tax rate will look like in terms of an increase for next year under the 3.27 rate. This isn't to say we didn't look at other scenarios. So we did look at a no increase option. And the only thing the no increase option really does is it just kind of kicks the can to an actually even worse position next year. Because not only are you still having to use a considerable amount of money to plug the budget, but then you don't have that available at your disposal next year. And if you don't get that net growth that's going to be able to kind of lower this number, you're going to have to increase funding with no use of surplus for next year to be able to lean out that cost. And so that's one where if nothing happens, even if it does happen and you do get some of those developments off the ground, you're still going to have to immediately raise revenues for next year as well. So the use of one-time surplus for 1 year rather than the use of one-time surplus in equal amounts over 3 years with a nominal increase actually keeps you at a lower rate for the next year, if you can think about it that way, because that number is bigger than $500,000. The other one, like we talked about, kind of that 2.18, and technically, if we wanted to completely fill in, that gap with the 1.13, that's also what's looking at. So we kind of look at both polar ends of it. And I'm not saying that we would do one or the other, but it's just good to know the entire spectrum. So with that increase, we can just kind of go right to the chart here. But if you did that, you would actually create significant surpluses over the next 2 years, but then you'd also have that FY24 surplus as well. So in the net, over 3 years, you'd have an accrued 1.2 million in surplus. Now, granted, is it justified for right now? That's the question you have to ask yourself, because you're creating a significant surplus that you might not have an immediate use for. Plus, you're raising it to a rate where the 3.9 doesn't go away. That just stays there at that rate and that level. And you would incur about, on average, nearly about $120 extra per year per property taxpayer who have a $186,000 assessed property. So it's one where it's kind of the pendulum swings from one way to the other one. And that's one where it wouldn't be as immediately justified, if that makes sense. So that's why we landed at the $500,000 increase. It's an 18% year-over-year increase. Our hope is to shrink any and all future rate increases in the future with new growth. And it's one where we're still doing what we needed to do, which is we had to close that structural deficit. That's like the priority number one is raise the floor and any means necessary, both with new revenue growth and making sure that that historical rate came up to based off of prior justified expenditures that were never funded. And then lengthens the use of surplus. So you're still using immediate assets to kind of keep that solvent path. And then also it gives you kind of an easier trajectory to bounce from our current funding level for transfers to capital to replenish our capital reserve to a lower hurdle. And then this is one where if we're going to be future facing, the new initiatives are funded by newer growth. So it's no longer kind of putting it on the legacy property tax rate, if you will. Granted, it's one where you don't want to always make a decision based off of the fact that you don't want to impart the burden because we're a collective community as well. But it's one where I think this is the best compromise solution. So with that, I'll kind of bounce into the public safety components of it. Like I said, Chief Greenwald can't be here tonight. So kind of the big takeaways for the police department budget, but first I'll just go into the kind of the breakdown. We provided this slide before. It's just kind of a summary for people's understanding of our public safety organizations, you know, how they're structured, how they're modeled. And it's kind of shows the difference between how we get those services both overseen by policy initiatives as well as funding initiatives, and then kind of what our commitments to them are structurally in terms of if they're codified or not, are they established by an IMA, just what have you. Excuse me. So with that, kind of a quick review for the police department. It's actually a pretty flat year over year. So that's one where there wasn't a significant change in the police department budget overall. They're in year 2 of a 4-year collective bargaining agreement with the Southern Chester County Regional Police Officers Association that was put into place in the beginning of this fiscal year. So that kind of keeps us on a more stable path with police over the next few years, because the #1 driver for police expenditures is police personnel, which is over about 80% of their total overall budget. And so these are just some kind of takeaways. The one thing that is a potential impact to the budget, granted, it depends on what that funding level is going to be, is they're currently renegotiating Avondale Borough's municipal contracts for service for policing. So based upon how that ends up, it could be kind of a similar proposed budget, or might even go down, if you will, in terms of the funding level, because of that cost allocation out to all of the participating agencies in that. It's also good to know that, you know, still with police, because of our regional model that we have and what we're funding, you know, when you're talking about what you're getting out of your policing service versus what other localities have to fund in order to get theirs, you know, we're still providing a pretty incredible value from a per capita perspective. And it's very good to put police in terms of per capita, because they directly support people in your community. So an overall cost of policing for us is orders of magnitude lower, because not only do we have more population, not only do we have more coverage area, not only do we have one of the highest budgets, but the fact of the matter that it's a shared expense overall is a huge component of it, that you can fund an efficient amount of officers to cover all of your coverage required, as well as provide detective services and a traffic safety division and other things that they have to provide. But it's also at an incredible deal as well too. So they do a great job of managing their function and keeping us in a strong position for policing services, because that's one of those backbone services as a locality. If you're going to try to seek maybe improving your conditions for economic development, a lot of new businesses coming in will want to know, hey, is there a local police department? So this is kind of what this kind of drove the kind of historical increases for funding for police. This is based off of the planned CBA agreement. But this is just kind of a trajectory of where they were to where they're going as well, based off of the biggest thing here, which is just anytime you renegotiate a CBA, it kind of throws it into a planned scheduled increase. The ability to work with another entity to share that cost is that slows the rate of increase over time, which is really kind of what you want to focus on. Another one that I thought was like a good thought exercise, because I get this question a lot. Hey, you know, that township over there doesn't have a high rate. And then I say, well, do they have a police department? And the answer is usually no. And I said, oh, that's why. You know, it's a very simple idea for the most part. But across Chester County, there are 73 total municipalities. You know, of those 73, 23 have state police contracts. So that's kind of an alternative to policing. And for the most part, if you have a state police contract, your average property millage rate is going to be pretty low for the most part. It's also important to know that of the 23, 15 of those are in Southern Chester County. So Southern Chester County has the highest percentage of state policing contracts in the entirety of Chester County. So that makes it also very much of an issue, because we're talking about expanding and growing into areas in Chester County. For us, it's usually who's right next door. Well, for us, who's next door doesn't have police. And my guess is they're not going to want to increase these rates in order to fund them as well, which creates a bit of a barrier. Now with that, for those that do have police, and of course, because a lot of people in Southern Chester County don't, you know, we're very low in terms of the representative percentage of localities in Chester County. Now with that though, the average millage rates are threefold for the most part. In fact, in Southern Chester County, it's significantly higher. So that's another one too, that if we're growing into a 3.27 rate, just look at our counterparts who also fund police in the area, and we're significantly lower by about half, and also still about a 1 mil lower than the Chester County average. So we're in a strong position when it comes to funding, I'll say a well-recognized and accredited agency at a incredible value. And that's one where for those that, because we like to compare based off of locality size for the most part, even amongst the localities that have a higher population base, and 5,000 actually isn't a lot of people. So I really lowered the bar in terms of entry here. we're kind of in the top third percentile, which is a good outcome. But really the commonality of who's above us, who's 1 through 12, it's localities with really strong earned income tax rate. And you can kind of do a cross section of these types of townships, and they all have something we don't, which is significantly higher earned income. In fact, a lot of them have almost nearly negligible millage rate because they have 4 times our EIT. You can do that when you have that much earned income tax. And so just one final recognition here before we segue into the fire part of it. But as we're talking about future growth, the township isn't the only township growing in Southern Chester County. But the issue is a lot of our neighbors don't fund police. And so that's one where, it's going to come to a head at some point that we're going to have to strain our municipal services to service other townships that don't pay for it. And that's going to happen because they're always projecting where it's going to come along. It's along that Route 1 corridor. So at some point, we're going to have to start thinking about what it means to fund what we have and also not push for a regional approach to be able to increase overall funding to it, because we're going to have to think about this at some point. Like it is coming. So just as a thought exercise, but overall, the overall story for the police department is it is kind of basically staying flat year over year in terms of expenditures, which is what we're really here to talk about tonight. So before I have Steve here coming up representing the Avondale Fire Company in their brief, these were just kind of plugged in based off of their proposed numbers from last year's line item detail here for the FY25 proposed. This is for the fire. If you remember, fire and EMS are split into kind of 2 different EIN kind of tax identities for the fire and EMS portions of Avondale Fire Company. But overall, when you're talking about the story for this year, it's mostly a personnel type increase that's supportive of both the fire and the police, the fire and the EMS components, which is more like BLS services for them. So you're gonna do a much better job explaining this than I possibly can. So I'll go ahead and just launch into your presentation here. So appreciate it.
Thank you. Good evening. A lot of slides. I'm gonna try and go through some of them. We'll get through it. All right. Some of these have been seen, but basically our call volume since 2014 for the fire has been up 12%. Busier township, more residents, more people going through the township has just kept us very busy. Along with that, we try and get out to all the events that New Garden offers, including Avondale Borough. That's National Night Out. We have the air show, which might be bigger next year. Who knows? EMS budget. EMS budget is the biggest one. That's where we run all our payroll. Everything for the fire company and the EMS goes through the EMS budget. So when we say we have firefighters on duty or EMS on duty, that's all going through one payroll through EMS. So that's why we see from 2018 to 2024, 104% increase in overall expenses. And the biggest thing is payroll expenses, 158%. We have tried to get all of our staff up to a point where they can try and make a livable wage to be kind of close to the station. A lot of our employees come from Lancaster, like northern Chester County, out that way, just because it's cheaper to live out there, and we know buying a house around here is a little expensive. So EMS starting wage is 13% less per hour than neighboring fire companies. I don't want to tell stories. I want to tell you a story that I just did an interview. At the end of the interview, the candidate asked me what our pay rate was. I told him what our pay rate was. He goes, "Okay, I just saw a neighboring fire company's hiring at $4 more an hour, right down the road." So we're kind of competing with that. That's why our budget increase is where it's at, because we're trying to increase that starting rate and increase where our current employees are at. Call volumes increased by 52%. You'll see where a lot of that is. That is Bowling Green, and I have a little graph to show where we're at with that. Jennersville, this is all stuff we've been talking about for the past couple of years with Jennersville closing. Wait times at Christiana and Chester County Hospital have been outrageous. And then you'll see the increase in base pay and insurance stipend to keep our employees. This is kind of stuff I know for most of you, we've gone over this. Volunteers are declining since 1970. We're looking at about 16 to 20 full-time employees per week to try and keep up the level of service that we're giving right now to our 5 municipalities, including New Garden. Our EMS apparatus. So we have the 2016 Chevy in the middle. That's our oldest. The 2021 was wonderfully purchased by New Garden Township that year. That was the ambulance you funded. The 2023, we are going to put in service on Wednesday. That's a re-chassis that cost us about $200,000. That was a 2015. That with the re-chassis and going into service will be about $250,000 less than buying a new ambulance. Right now, a new ambulance with all the Stretcher and power load and everything would be about $450,000. So at $200,000, that was a bargain and a no-brainer for us to keep a third ambulance. Our current equipment right now, we signed a lot of contracts back in 2021 to do service plans. So we're keeping that off the budget right now. That's something we're gonna have to look at in the next couple of years to kind of bring that back in the budget to keep our equipment to move patients in service. This is the fire apparatus right now. Last year, we sold the rescue. So the squad was one of the engines that kind of took the place of the rescue, multi-purpose. So we have 2 engines, a tanker, the traffic unit, utility, command vehicles, and traffic signboard. So reducing that apparatus because of volunteers, cost of the apparatus was something that we had chose to do. Duty crew versus home response. A lot of fire companies nowadays are trying to staff, instead of career staff, trying to do duty crew staffing. So that is volunteers that stay at the station for certain hours. Right now, we're trying to do 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. That's when we see our big increase. The decrease is kind of every other time, 2 a.m., weekdays when they're at school or they're working. But it has increased participation during those brief times. And that goes into the budget later when I talk about where we're going to add coverage. Home response, we still have a few that respond from home, but as we talked about those 4 potential developments that are going to be built, as they're built, they are lighter construction than we're getting anywhere else, like Avenue Borough or some of the older homes, and we're behind the 8 ball as soon as we start responding. Just quick over the career staff. So in 2014, we switched over from just EMS to firefighter EMTs. So we had 2 ambulance personnel EMTs that would also fight fire. Fast forward to 2024, we are at 5 during the daytime, 3 overnight. That includes 13 full-time employees, including myself. So 1 ambulance is 17,520 hours coverage. We also provide an extra 15,000 hours of coverage with part-timers and additional full-time and myself. That might be a second ambulance that's staffing the fire engine, events, all that. So we have the career staff manager, myself, 4 full-time on-duty supervisors, 8 full-time firefighters. They work at 24/72, so they work every 4 days for 24 hours, and then they may go to another job. Mike Decker here works 2 full-time jobs. He goes from Oxford to here. So, and we have what, 5, I think, that do that? 5 of our full-timers do that. They go from one to the next. Just a quick on our schedule. So, so during the day, Monday through Friday, we have 5 during the daytime. So that's 5 firefighter EMTs. On the weekend, we have 4 firefighter EMTs during the day. During the weekday, obviously, people are at work, at school. We upstaff for that. Overnight, we keep 3. So that's 3 firefighter EMTs. That's 3 full-timers. That's staffing 1 ambulance, and hopefully that's a driver or a firefighter to supplement the volunteers that hopefully are coming up. With the budget increase, our hope is to add a 4th here from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. That's going to either put a second ambulance on the street for the community or add an additional firefighter. So that's 1 less volunteer doesn't show up. We can staff the fire apparatus appropriately. I put this in here for that turnover. So, so this group here is our current, some of our full-timers. Some of our full-timers, these is a group that they don't work too often. They probably get unlimited overtime at their current full-time job. And then we've just done a crazy hiring spree over the last few years because either the grass is green on the other side, it's better pay, it's $4 more an hour down the road, whatever that may be. So we're just trying to keep up and keep our staffing level to serve. This is just the platoons, which I think you guys have a copy of all this if you want to go into that. So this is kind of where we're at. 2015, we were averaging almost 8 volunteers per call, and we barely had career staff on the trucks. We fast forward to 2024, we're averaging about 2.5 volunteers per call, and that's 24 hours a day. So while I said that increase during 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. was a little higher, it's not that all the time. So, and a little more than 2 career staff on the fire apparatus, not ambulances. That's completely separate. So that's always 2 personnel, 24/7, 365. But this is just how many are getting on the fire apparatus. So that trend. This trend is also why in 2020 we were awarded that SAFER grant. So we were awarded that staffing for adequate fire and EMS response grant that lasted 3 years. We were fortunate with COVID that we didn't have to keep that up. We did. We were able to do that with some billing and revenue increases from our municipalities. So that was pretty cool, but billing income, it's tough. So right here, our net billing, right now for this year, we're at 503,000. We've brought in 357,000. That is a huge change. And I think the next slide, I'll show you why that changes. So an 18-month trend, right here, we switched billing companies. So we felt like we weren't getting our money's worth with our current billing company. May of 2023, we switched and have almost doubled our monthly income from billing. So that was what we found out. Our previous billing company was not billing Bowling Green patients appropriately. They have Maryland Medicaid and Delaware and things like that. And our billing company, the previous one, did not have contracts for that. So they were able to start bringing that back. The big jump was when our current billing company went back and rebuild a bunch of patients that were never billed. So we kind of took this step that we needed to try and offset some of the costs to the township and fundraising and so on. Breakdown, Medicare, Medicaid, that's our biggest, and that's a fixed rate. So we're not going to get our base rate of $950 plus mileage on all our Medicare and Medicaid patients. We're just kind of getting what we get. And then, as Bob can explain later, if it's a Medicare or Medicaid call and ALS is involved, then we have a rate that we pay and contract with ALS, so that takes for both of us. Dispatches, it's kind of the same every year. New Garden's our largest, 65%. And these are dispatches. So where we have like 22% other, that's down from previous years. And like I said, this is dispatches. So we're getting recalled a lot by West Grove and Longwood, where previous years that was probably higher and we were going out and covering them. Their staffing has gone up tremendously. So we are staying in our community a little bit more, but we're still just as busy. Calls for the past years. Per township, you can see New Garden Township goes up pretty drastically. So dispatches, so we do get covered every so often. Longwood, West Grove, and Hockessin cover us the most. We're looking at about 200 or so times this year that they've come into either New Garden Township or any of our other 4 municipalities. How many times we go out of district? And again, this is dispatches. So while London Grove looks like we went there 79 times, we may have gone maybe 50% of those to actually transport or see a patient. Fire calls per township kind of remain constant. You can see New Gardens at 391 for this year. Past years. So the funding formula. In 2020, we went to, with our meetings with London Grove Township, we started using the kind of widely used 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 funding formula that Franklin and London Grove kind of adopted with West Grove Fire Company. It seemed fitting that we should obviously be using the same formula. So for fire, it goes by population, assessed property value, and call volume for the year prior. So I'm sorry, 2 years prior. So 2025, we have to use a full year's data in 2023 for call volume. So when you break that down with where New Garden's at, the 2025 contribution based on our budget deficit of 476,000 is 392. And that's where you can see where the other municipalities kind of fall in that. And that's all based on their call volume. So 83% of fire calls are in New Garden Township. And this is for like our first 2 municipalities. We kind of take out the mutual aid calls. So I think our call volume was a little over 500 in 2023. This is just for the first 2, the ones we would put into the formula. EMS is a little different. In our meetings in 2020 and 21, 2 of our municipalities really didn't like the assessed property value being in for EMS. We're just going for calls. We're just going for a patient. It makes no difference whether, assessed property value is in there. So this is just with call volume. So it's our 5 municipalities with call volume. So with our increase to the staffing level with that 4-person overnight, our pay increase, our payroll increase, our budget deficit was going to be around 813,250, and this would be our municipal contributions. One of the things in talking with Chris and Guy and I kind of wanted to look at was where Bowling Green, if treated as a full municipality, would fall. So they are 23% of New Garden Township's call volume is just at Bowling Green Inn. And this is where, if they contributed as a full municipality, that's what they would contribute. We did send that to the CEO, and we were basically just blown off. Guy can talk about that, but he was kind of like, we can't do anything more than what we give you a month, which is $2,000. So we are trying, we're working with them. We send them a monthly report to bill them, say, hey, Medicare, Medicaid's not covering it. You're not covering it. It's such a tax. And this is just EMS. This isn't the fire call. So we went there 3 times today. We took 2 ambulance calls and we had a fire call there, which we chased around a smoke detector for what, half hour. So it's just a constant battle with Bowling Green. And you can see, when you see the New Garden increase, this is where New Garden, Bowling Green. And then our total combined request, where we were at, which most of you have seen this in the past. We were kind of stagnant for several years, and then working with Steve Alvan and the chairman, we've been increasing pretty rapidly. Same thing with fire. So we did put a little long-term planning and growth. This is where we're looking at right now. There's obviously going to be probably some changes in the next couple of years, but right now, 4th position overnight, 10 to 6 a.m., possibly looking at some kind of chief officer position or something to help the volunteer side of that, as like an executive side or administrative side. And then we kind of move into adding more through the years.
Thank you.
So I don't have to stand back up really at this point, but that really concludes kind of the amount. We do have Robert Hotchkiss from Southern Chester County EMS here as well. Now, overall EMS services are going up for Avondale Fire, but also I think about 9,000 in the net, close to for Southern Chester County EMS is just kind of an overall component of our EMS services. You have the packets there in front of you, but we don't really have like a planned presentation to it. But at this point, we would just be open to any questions.
Data on the average response time. Okay, thanks. They're both, whatever you add. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll make sure that that gets over to you as well. And my apologies, that was actually supposed to, we were talking about that one. That was my miss in terms of getting that into the actual budget presentation.
I mean,
I hate this. You know, you guys do a lot for the community. So, I mean, we thank you and we'll see what we can do. Is there anything that we as a township, and then this isn't a question like to be answered now, but something just to think about, is there anything we can do to help facilitate additional revenue coming in from Bowling Green?
They are not incentivized to really be obligating any. So really, other than political pressure, there's no real ordinance or mandate or fee or anything that we can charge separately for them being here in our township. It's just the fact that they're here. So if we could just redraw the line and move them into one of the Marlboros, that would be one solution to it. But other than that, there's really nothing that we can do as a township, really.
That was a good one.
There is.
I reached out to.
I mean, also, I would include Chester County Press or, you know, some of the news as well.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
No. Now,
Yeah.
to my understanding, it's also one where it's not like anything really changed with the population of those who are at the actual organization, like patients. But it was in their operating model where essentially now everything is essentially just full transport anytime you call 911. So everything is an immediate kind of inability for them to internally handle it. And that just kind of raised calls for service. And as long as they kind of think about in terms of just calls for service for BLS, ALS services are the primary driver for townships funding BLS and ALS services for the most part. So the other one in terms of Bowling Green is just the fact that if you go back to where we talked about the state of the township, we're still a single station shop here. You know, we don't have that regional partner as well. So it's one where that with getting with Bowling Green, now you're talking about not just addressing one solution, but now you're talking about a macro level issue to be able to really drive tangible change. I would say those are the things that we should be focusing on is distributing that held cost with other townships while also working with Bowling Green. And I can see that as kind of a major ability to compress our overall cost for service as well as a township, rather than just political pressure on Bowling Green. I just want to make sure that there's other considerations that we're looking at.
Well, I mean, it's always also like a county initiative, right?
Mhm.
To have these types of treatment centers available to people, but they come at a cost, and
Yep.
that doesn't sound like those costs are being, supported from
Yeah.
the county.
Well, there are models in other states where counties have health and mental and
Right.
wellness services provided as subsidized at the county level. But that's you're talking about
Mhm.
getting Chester County to commit funding resources to build out the capital costs of
Right.
and hiring of personnel. So unless they have a funding mechanism behind that, I don't see how they're going to do that. Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, they're a for-profit company, correct? They're not nonprofit, right? So, I mean, are they expanding? Who is their parent company? Where are they going? And I think like
Mhm.
maybe some of this data would be
Yep.
good for them to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hope they cooperate. I'm not,
Mhm.
optimistic. We've been talking about this for years and years, but it's at the taxpayer's expense, which isn't exactly fair. Yeah. All right.
Now, other than that issue, I know we had a lot of topics that we talked about. Is there any other questions from just like a broad brush approach to funding for the budget as well as to just some year-over-year changes? I just want to make sure that we're answering anything while we have more attention. Of course, we'll be
No, I mean,
relitigating this
in terms
discussion in the
of
public the
salaries,
next few.
I mean, I hate that we're that far behind the curve, with neighboring departments.
That's another one where, I mean, even as you said it, you have certain folks and staff that have to work two jobs within the same network where
Right.
you have the same salary scales competing against each other. So there is kind of like without a county level, kind of like wider distribution to
Support.
wholesale it.
Yep.
We're going to be kind of keeping up with the Joneses against our counterparts immediately to the east and the west of us. Now, if I mean, I can dig it back up, but in that state of the township brief, we kind of showed the map. We're kind of wedged in between two sizable commissions, that have kind of economies of scale when it comes to funding. So as long as we're a single station ship here, we're always going to be out competed because they're going to be able to raise more revenue from a larger revenue base to be able to fund salaries and wages to get services provided. And I hate to kind of keep going back to it, but that's like, you're talking about the strategic fix. Like that's the strategic fix on my
I
recommendation.
mean, no one's gonna like what I say next, but the 11.2% that we get from the county, or that we contribute to the county, not we
Mm.
get from the county, the same way that we have to justify our budget. I wish that somebody from the county could come here and also justify what we're getting for the 11.2%.
No.
All right, I'm done. That's not popular though,
Yeah.
so.
Any other questions?
No, any other questions?
I mean, I feel like we've done a pretty consistent job at continuing to press that these are the issues that the township's facing, granted with a plan out of it. You know, some of them are more viable than others in terms of immediacy, but we're working as a staff to complete them. But I'm sorry, gentlemen, I saw a raised hand behind you, Paul.
Yeah, Mr. Andrade?
I'm thinking of like massive fire where you have a toxic cloud, people have to evaluate, or maybe a range around it, maybe something like that house, in Ohio, or tank of truck on 41 that blows up or something. Is there any way to prepare for something like that? They have to identify locations that might be a danger. And is there anything that can be done, have some kind of thing, if such an event occurs?
To all, to also address the question, just making sure it's getting recorded here. And so the question being in terms of response capabilities for catastrophic events, which also would exceed just the scope of the fire company. It would be a full-on public safety response for everybody from an emergency management situation. So, I mean, even with fire, they have built into their ISO ratings kind of an identification of, we'll call them those like higher risk areas of known interest. So, I mean, I used to work in a city that had a railway crossing. That was like our number one risk, was that railway crossing, because it was an active Amtrak and railway daily commuter station. So train derailment, but those are identified, but they get melded into an overall emergency response type plan for the township. So it's not just what might happen, but who is going to respond to it as well. And that's a larger approach. And that's one where when we talk about emergency management and building out that capacity to make sure the township is a little bit more resilient, if you will, that's what we're talking about. So having those identified response plans, training to it, at least nothing replaces the real thing, but you can at least have those tabling discussions and maybe some organized training available, as well as just maybe some public participation in those exercises as well, just to get people familiar with these are your biggest risks. Now, most of those will likely come from bad weather events rather than some of like, you know, we don't have like a nuclear power facility in the township, although I think they might turn 3 Mile Island back on, so I don't know about that. But we're luckily a little bit further away from there. But it's part of a larger kind of response posture for the township than just fire and EMS. But you're right to ask. It is something to really make sure that we understand what our biggest threats are. Yeah. So like essentially it would just be commercial trucking. So where we would go from here is essentially we'll reintroduce this at a public meeting, continue to just make sure that the public at least has a sense of understanding of what the plan is for the township going into next year. And then we have at least 3 more planned engagements. But if there's one where the last 2 workshops are as required, so if it's one where the board feels like they're prepared to go forward to that November meeting with the agenda item to adopt, well, not to adopt, but to advertise the budget for adoption in the November meeting, you know, we'll make that plan as well too, which would, I think, negate the need for the 5th workshop. But that's the plan, unless there's any other questions.
No,
Any other scenarios, any other way I could paint it? All right.
no, doing a great job. Thank
Yep.
you, Chris. Yeah, thank you for everyone who came out. Appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much for the upcoming meeting. We'll have the Q3 reports from fire, EMS, Avondale, and just the police as well. So that'll be another engagement capability for people to ask questions should we have more people in the audience.
Okay.
All right.
Great. All right, meeting is adjourned then. All right, thank you.